Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, this is another bill that takes away power from our
Colleagues, this is a bill to amend the Emergency Services
government.
Act of 1973 to empower the legislature to serve as an appropriate check on executive power during a declared state of an emergency. Many of you likely found yourselves in the same situation that I was back a year ago at the beginning of this pandemic, and as the pandemic continued, both Republican and Democrat, hearing from your constituents who were upset with some of the things that were being dictated by the executive branch. And I'm sure many of you, like I did, heard from restaurant owners, hair salon owners, other small business owners, dentists, medical professionals, about the things and measures that were being put into place, and wondering what we were doing down here and why we were voting on these things. And probably many of you, like me, had to respond to your constituents that I didn't have a vote on that. I didn't have anything to do with that. Here's the governor's office phone number. And what I will say is, I want to be clear from the outset that this is not a criticism of Governor Hutchinson or the administration or many of the measures that they had to take. This was an unprecedented situation, and the governor had to make many tough decisions. And so I want to be clear that this is not a criticism for how the governor handled it. But what it is an effort to do is to restore an appropriate balance of power between the executive branch and the legislative branch, so that the legislative branch, the people's representatives, have a say in emergency situations. And so I'm going to try to go through quickly what the bill does. It does a number of things that I believe are very important, again, to ensuring appropriate checks and balances on executive power and ensuring that we, the legislature, have a say in emergency situations. So at the beginning of the bill, one of the first things you see is we say that an emergency disaster declaration can last no longer than 60 days. And if it's a public health emergency disaster declaration and the governor wishes to renew it, he'll have to come to legislative council to seek renewal. And that's set forth a little bit further in more detail later in the bill. Also, at the outset of the bill, what we do is we empower the legislature to terminate a state of emergency at any time. And that's any state of emergency. That's one declared on the local level, and that's a statewide state of disaster emergency. How do we do that as the legislature? The bill sets forth processes on how we get to that meeting. Number one, that meeting can be called by the Speaker of the House. It can be called by the President Pro Tem of the Senate. Or if 51 members of the House or 18 members of the Senate request the meeting, then the chambers will meet in a committee of the whole to consider termination of the governor's declaration of disaster emergency. And so at any time, if the legislature believes that the governor has gone too far with the declaration of a disaster emergency, we have set forth a mechanism for the legislature to respond and to terminate that state of disaster emergency. The next thing that you'll see is that if the governor wishes to declare a state of disaster emergency that is a public health state of disaster emergency, the governor has to specifically state that. And then we deal with processes for if it is a statewide state of disaster emergency. So the bill makes a distinction between regular states of disaster emergency, which do not require a meeting of the legislature, and then statewide state of disaster emergencies, which will require a meeting of the legislature at the outset. So if there is a declaration of a disaster emergency that affects the entire state, then the entire state's representatives at the outset deserve the opportunity to come in and weigh in on that decision of whether or not there should be a declared state of disaster emergency and whether that will continue. And so the bill sets forth in the next section that the legislature, upon the declaration of a statewide state of disaster emergency, will meet within 8 days of that declaration to decide whether to continue or to terminate that state of disaster emergency.
Right on the button.
What is a statewide state of disaster emergency? It's defined very specifically in the bill. It's defined as affecting at least 19 counties or at least 25% of the overall population of the state.
Right on the button.